First foraging class of the year has come and gone about a week ago. And just yesterday, Daphne had her cheese class. That means next week we'll have our second foraging class of the year. And I'm heading off into the deep woods to do some scouting. There's lots of good things up now. Some things I'd like to see that aren't up yet, such as sorrels, which are a bit unpredictable when they rise. They could rise early summer, midsummer, late summer, never can quite tell. I'm hoping after the rain to come across some things like coral mushrooms as well, just for dinner tonight. I doubt I'll see enough to really make a point of during the foraging class. But let's head off into the woods and see what can be found today. Lots of witch hobble, which you can see in this photograph right here. I'm finding quite a bit of it, which means it seems to be spreading through the forest. Now, a witch hobble, sometimes known as hobble bush, is a form of verbenum that puts out a very large berry, about half the size of a big grape, say in size equal to about the first knuckle of a man's hand. And the berries are remarkably good. They taste like a cross between honey, dates, and raisins. The witch hobble is a close cousin of the wild raisin, which tastes just the same, only its berries are smaller. Now, you tend to find wild raisin in waste places and disturbed ground, like along the edges of dirt roads and such back here, and along the edges of meadows where livestock are not wont to go. But deep in the forest, you'll find the witch hobble. It's an understory plant that likes to grow in the shade of mature woods. I will harvest the berries because I can harvest it without damaging the plant. The plant used to be very common. Unfortunately, it's much less common these days due to the wanton and unmanaged depredations of Forest Nova Scotia, which is a largely foreign logging concern that has the government and many locals in the province convinced that the best thing they can possibly do with their beautiful and unique Acadian forest is convert those woods into pulp plantations. So the native Acadian forests are cut down and replaced with pulpwood, which is primarily black spruce, which turns good land in effect into a waste place. But that's a topic for another time. I'm glad to see all the witch hobble. It's a very good berry. I hope to find more later. Right here we have starflower. I've sought for ages to find a use for this particular plant and can't find anything, but it's a lovely flower, and it's always interesting to me because it's somewhat unique in the botanical world because it has 7 petals. Very few flowers have 7 petals. Unfortunately, this particular starflower appears to have its 2 lower petals either broken off or crinkled, so they don't all show up in the image. This lovely plant here is Clintonia, also known as blue-bead lily. You might notice it looks an awful lot like ramp, which is sometimes called wild leeks, even though it has no taxonomical relationship to the leek. However, Clintonia leaves, when they're young, tender, and fresh, though, taste like cucumber. In fact, they taste extraordinarily closely to cucumber, so much so that it's somewhat unusual to eat them because the leaves have a very different texture. They're more like a very, very succulent kind of lettuce, and yet when you eat it, you'd swear by the taste it was cucumber. So it's a little confusing to the brain when you eat. But you can tell these are Clintonia, not ramp, by those young berries right there. They're not mature. The Clintonia plant forms beautiful, large blueberries that occur in small groups of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The berries are toxic, so they should not be eaten. Here we have a great example of the pale hues of the Clintonia blossom. There's the Clintonia plant just below. The stalks of the blossoms and berries are grown come up about 1 foot to 14 inches. Now, if you spend as much time in the woods as I do, it's important to have a variety of ways to get by. Now, I know these days a lot of people are using GPS devices as their fallback or even primary means of navigating. And GPS devices can be very good. They're very accurate. They take a minimum of skill. They're fairly reliable. Even the ones that are not terribly reliable are going to get you where you're going within a couple of 100 yards of accuracy. However, if you get a cloudy day, GPS devices cannot be relied on. If it's stormy, if there's lightning, it cannot be relied on. You could always drop it and break it. Some other malfunction could happen. It could just run out of battery power. I like things that are reliable. I like old-fashioned things. When I was in Alaska, I had a sailboat. I did a lot of blue water navigation out on the ocean and learned how to use the old-fashioned compass and sextant and watch to find my way. And I still think the compass is the standard by which all other means of woodsman's navigation should be measured. Now, my mother-in-law bought me this compass a few years back, and I was really happy about it. She didn't exactly buy me the compass. She gave me a gift certificate for the store that sold it, and I hadn't even mentioned that I wanted it, but that's where it went to. This compass I'd had my eyes on, and it's more than adequate for my needs. It does have all the measurement markings on the base if you're going to use a chart. Sometimes I use charts, but only if I'm going into unfamiliar terrain and I'm looking for something very specific and need some very precise measurements. Now I always have the compass with me. I always have this compass with me. And I just used it to shoot bearings. Now this is a fairly easy process. Now let's say there's a tiny dirt road just about 100 yards back that I got off of, from which I set out into the woods, which there is. It's just over there. And let's say that I want to maintain a course into the forest, going exactly opposite that road. So what I'm going to do, it's easier for me to do this by setting it on the ground since I have to use another hand to hold the camera. See that red arrow right there? It's fixed on the base of the dial. That red arrow turns if I turn the dial. But notice that the needle holds steady. Now the red side of the needle points north. That's our north. I'm going to just turn this dial until the red arrow lines up parallel with the red needle. And now as I'm going through the woods, whether I've hiked a half mile or a mile or 10 miles, whenever I need to confirm I'm going in the right direction, I just turn the compass and make sure that the red needle, the magnetic north, is lined up with the arrow on the base of the dial. When I'm ready to go home, all I have to do to go home is turn around until the white half of the needle is lined up parallel with the arrow on the base of the dial, and that's my course back out. Now that would only work if I'm going a pretty straight course in and a pretty straight course out. And of course, if you're going long distances, there have to be corrections. If you want to be more complicated, let's say you're going to go into the woods this direction, which takes me deeper into the forest. This forest goes on and on. Let's say I'm planning to go 5 miles. Well, that's roughly 2 hours of hiking. So in that case, I would also have a watch with me, or I'd carefully watch the sun, though a watch is going to be much more useful for these purposes, especially since you might lose the sun. But you're going to have a watch with you, and you calculate 2 hours of hiking, 5 miles through the forest. If the forest is thick and dense and the hiking's slow going, you calculate 1.5 miles per hour. So let's say I can move relatively rapidly. I'm going to cover 2.5 miles per hour. After 2 hours or 5 miles, I'm going to stop there, and let's say at that point I know that I need to go right 80 or 90 degrees or whatever. I could then adjust my bearing. I can adjust the dial to accommodate my new bearing. Now you've changed course here, so you have to watch your timing. You decide you're going to travel on 2 more hours that way. Well, you check your watch. It's best to use a stopwatch for this, or make sure that you carefully note the time. And you travel another 2 hours that way. Now, to find your way out, you would just, at 2 hours, you would just do your reverse course by lining up the white half of the compass needle with the red arrow and going 2 hours that way. And then you would turn your bearing in the direction of the way out. Realign your compass needle to the way out. Watch your watch. It should take you about 2 more hours to find your way out, following your way out. One of these days I'll do a whole course on how to use a compass to simply but effectively shoot bearings and make sure that you always know where you're going and where you are in the woods. Now this is a very pleasant tasting berry. The berries grow directly under these lanceolate leaves with the relatively straight, deep veins. When they're ripe, they're reddish, and they taste somewhat like watermelon. They're quite pleasant, however, they are known to have something of a laxative effect, so you want to eat them in moderation, only a few at a time. Possibly throw them in salad or whatnot. They're very refreshing, they're very nice, just only have just a few at a time. Here we have an interesting example of starflower. You can see all 7 petals. However, the petals have fallen off the stalk that they grow on, and they've landed directly on that leaf, and as the leaf dried, it's as if the petals have sealed themselves to the leaf. Interesting. Nature's full of curiosities. Here we have a great example of starflower. Had to look a bit. It's getting a bit late in the season to still find them on the plant, but there are a few left. Now here we have a little known and underappreciated, relatively common plant. I'd say this one falls more in the bracket of uncommon. You see it often enough, just not everywhere. This is Pearly Everlasting. And this is a useful edible. Those tender young leaves can be used almost any time. It's a distinctive and relatively easy plant to identify with its pale silvery sheen, and the leaves have a distinctively furry feel. It's almost like you're petting a small animal that is soft but very fuzzy, such as a hamster. Wild strawberry is so common that it's almost unremarkable in Nova Scotia. We'll cover this during the class though, because many people aren't all that familiar with it. When using wild strawberry, naturally you can use the berry fruits. It should be easy for anybody to identify. They look like the same strawberries you'd buy at a farmer's market or grocery, just in miniature. They're very sweet and tart, more flavorful than what you're going to buy at a farmer's market or a grocery, more flavorful even than heritage variety strawberries you're going to buy directly from a farm or grow in your own garden. They're quite nice, but because they're small, you have to pick quite a few of them to amount to anything. You could pick for an hour and maybe get a half cup if you're lucky. But just as useful as the strawberries are those blossoms and those leaves. They are both very good in tea. They add a lot of flavor and have nutritive value as well. Not to be overlooked are the tender tips of spruces, all spruces. I like them best when they're very young and very tender, right at the start of spring, when the tips have a little brown papery shell over them to protect the young new growth from the cold of the early spring. Those tips have a very mild flavor. The younger they are, the more mild. At this point, they're mature enough, they're starting to get a bit of an overwhelming spruce flavor. But when they're very young like that, the flavor is very mild and pleasant. I don't think that they're honestly great straight in and of themselves in the same way that you probably wouldn't want to just sit down and eat the leaves of lettuce. But they are very good in stir fries and mixed up in stews and soups. They're also quite good in salads. You just have to do a little something with them. However, they're so pleasant and so versatile, they're good almost any way that you use them. This is wood sorrel, sometimes called forest shamrock. Very good. It tastes like sheep sorrel or meadow sorrel. It looks very different from sheep sorrel, which has a bit of a horseshoe look or an arrowhead look. Wood sorrel and meadow sorrel look very much like the shamrocks of traditional Ireland. In fact, this is the shamrock. A lot of people think that clover is the shamrock, but it's not. This is the shamrock. Notice the truly heart-shaped three-part leaves. That's what makes this the shamrock. The taste is very nice. It's tart and lemony, and it's very good in stir fries. We often use it to replace lemongrass when we're cooking Oriental recipes. Very handy since lemongrass itself doesn't grow very readily at our latitude, not even if carefully nurtured in our gardens, not unless we were going to greenhouse it really. And I don't greenhouse things. I aim for self-sufficiency, and in my way of thinking, if I have to grow it in a greenhouse, then it's more trouble than it's worth. This is an interesting little plant right up here. When I first saw it, I thought it was a dwarf kind of cannabis. This is actually cinquefoil. And I did not see cinquefoil when I was living in Alaska, so this one's relatively new to me. I don't know of any particular use for it, except that it's just a curious plant and has a pretty little flower. Here, growing under these young spruces, is bunchberry. Well, this is a plant we've covered more fully elsewhere. And this is just a perfect little patch of it. These blooms are at the height of their beauty right now. Now, those large white petals, those are actually sepals, the outer protective covers of the actual flowers. Notice what looks like a central cluster of pistils and stamens is actually a cluster of flowers. Tiny little flowers, each with their own petals, pistils, and stamens. The insects will fertilize those, and those little flowers inside of the sepals will each develop into a plump red berry, about the size of a good-sized blueberry. The bunchberry, I think, is an underappreciated forageable. The plant itself is closely related to the dogwood tree, actually. Diminutive as this plant is, it rarely ever gets more than 4 or 5 inches tall. But the berries themselves are underappreciated. They have a very mild apple flavor. In fact, so mild that if you were to try 1 or 2 of the berries, you would think it really wasn't worth bothering with at all. They don't really seem to taste like much of anything. You can catch a faint hint of the appleness. To really appreciate bunchberries though, the thing to do is just make your hands kind of into a claw or a swipe like that, kind of like the hood cups that we use to harvest blueberries en masse. and then just sweep your hand across the berries and get a handful of them. It's very easy to get them handfuls at a time doing that, and eat them by the handful, and that really brings out the appliness. They will not have the tartness of actual apples, they'll never have that, but they do have a very distinctive apple flavor. Now during the late summer and the autumn, when the nights are starting to get brisk, one of my favorite things to do, oh, I hear thunder in the distance. Oh well, no matter, plenty of trees to take shelter under. But during late summer and August, when the evenings are starting to get brisk, one of my favorite things to do is gather enough of them to about fill a cup. And then I take the back of my knife or the carved flat edge of a knife or any kind of flat tool and just mash them. And I'll mash them down till they occupy only the lower half or even lower quarter of the cup. And I'll boil water and pour that onto the bunchberries. Then add a little sugar or honey to that, and if I've been clever, I'll have brought some cinnamon sticks along, and I'll throw in a piece of a cinnamon stick, and voila, you can have spiced apple cider anywhere on the trail. Looks like we have some young wild raisin here. It's right at the edge of this trail where it gets more light. These little cymes of blossoms will open out a bit and then turn into berries that will go from pinkish red ultimately to a blue-black, at which point they'll be ripe. Here we have young bracken coming up. This is a plant to be eaten with extreme caution. Bracken is commonly eaten in Japan. However, bracken is a known carcinogen, and the Japanese have among the highest rates of stomach cancer, which is largely attributed to their predilection for bracken. Honestly, I would not eat it unless one were in a real survival situation and you had no other choice. In that case you might have it, but I would equate it to eating cigarettes, really. This is wild violet, and it's fairly common here during the spring. Now we're a little past mid-June, so I did not expect to see it anymore. It's usually gone by then. But violet's a useful plant, mainly for the flowers. You can take those flowers and add them to salads or put them in stir fries. At the homestead, what we like to do is take the flowers and crystallize them in plain sugar, and that makes it's hard to describe it. It's almost like a perfumed hard candy. The only thing I can tell you to do is try it for yourself. This bit of old forest is one of my most favorite places in all of Nova Scotia. This and a few other places. This and a few other places, like the hidden waterfall behind our land up in Cape Breton. But there was a dead birch tree. It's not the one right there at the center of the screen. It was up on the hillock up there, dead birch tree. And it was a really good source of Pinellas mushrooms every year. That's the false oyster. But I don't see it. Either I'm missing it due to the thickness of the foliage, or more likely it fell over due to the brutal wind and snow of last winter. And near the top of this ridge, it's probably 900 feet up, maybe 1,000 feet, and while it's not all that high, being near the top, it does expose this woodland to the wild winds of winter. If it fell, I'll find it later in the season and continue to be able to get Pinellas mushrooms from it, but I'll also have to start looking more avidly for a new source of late season false oysters. This is Clintonia again, and it's probably around 7, maybe 7:30. And in the pale early evening light, we can see the delicate butter hues of the Clintonia blossoms much better. Note the very long pistils and stamens. The blossoms themselves are comprised of 6 petals, or sepals. I'm not sure which taxonomic classification they fall under. And I don't have a field guide with me, so I couldn't look it up right now to tell you. Usually I don't carry field guides with me in the bush for the very specific reason that I want to memorize the various plants and fungi. So what I'll do, if I find something new, I'll photograph it, go back home, and look it up. Or if I see something in a field guide at home that I'm particularly interested in, I'll do my best to commit it to memory, and then try to find it in the field, then photograph it at all angles, top and bottom, as well as make notes on its fragrance, taste, and any other distinctive characteristics, then go back home and cross-reference that to one of the field guides. Sometimes if I'm on extended trips, if I'm going to be away for days, I might carry a field guide with me. I also keep a collection of field guides on my tablet. And since I have a small solar panel that I can use to recharge the tablet, I can use that pretty much indefinitely while out. Well, it's getting to be about 7:30, maybe 8. And I promised Daphne I would build a fire and cook smoked burgers tonight. So that's on the agenda. And I have about an hour to hike before I get out of the woods. So I think this might be my last recording for the day. Poor Will-O-Wisp is thirsty after a long trip. And a little hot. He likes to cool his paws down. What a smart boy. Well, that's only a few of the things we're going to cover during the upcoming foraging trip. Of course, there's lots more. Forage of meadows, forage that you find in the weeds of gardens, forage that people often overlook, like the usnea that grows in old and dying trees, which has so many medicinal purposes. There are many, many things we're going to cover during this foraging class, and it'll be a good one. The little scouting trip I just took showed me that there's even more out and ready to be found than I thought there was. So the students will learn a lot and have a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something yourself. Keep watching to learn more about the natural world and the joys of getting to know it. As always, go soft, go gently, and leave no trace. Let's go home, boy.